Well, Stefan, let's look first at your career path. What was your route to CFO?
So I worked in Singapore between 2004 and 2008. And really, the move to Singapore was a natural consequence of the role that I had with American Express at the time. So I'd been with American Express in New Zealand for a couple of years, between 2002 and 2004, as the CFO of their consumer card business. Having done that job for 2 years, and there was no more senior finance role within New Zealand, large multinational organisations, as they do, were encouraging me to move on to a more senior and consequently more regionally based role, and I was offered a position in Singapore.
We often hear executives talk about lifestyle. To what extent was lifestyle an important factor for you?
When we were thinking about coming back to settle somewhere, and we looked at the UK, which is where I'm from originally, and we looked at London, which is where I worked when I was younger, most of my friends and most of my contacts, most of my family had moved on and were no longer in London. We'd lived in Toronto, but same again, all of our friends had moved away from Toronto. We'd lived in Sydney. Everyone that we knew had moved away from Sydney. Singapore wasn't quite home for us. We didn't really know people there. It was more of an expat type of environment. So actually it was a case of where do we have that community sense of community or that sense of belonging. And of all of the places we could have chosen, Auckland was the one that had the best group of friends for us, if you will, to enable my wife and my kids to settle and feel comfortable as quickly as possible, really.
You've been away from New Zealand for years now. How important are contacts? How important is it to maintain a network of contacts?
The one thing I would say you'd have to do when you're travelling as much as I did is you always have to maintain your contacts as best as you possibly can. Now that's a hard thing to do, because you're always caught up in the moment, in the work that you're doing and in the country that you're in, and you're trying to build a network where you happen to be. But it is very important to have, I'd say, some key contacts in the country that you ultimately want to come back to. Now, I didn't make the choice to come back to New Zealand until probably a year or 2 years before we finally moved back. But throughout my career, I have always kept key contacts in each of the cities that I've worked in. And I think that's an important message, or it's an important lesson to learn, is that if you do want to come back to a city, when you move away from it, it's extremely important to maintain those contacts.
What do you think are the main benefits of being back in New Zealand?
When I look at what my family enjoys doing, what I enjoy doing with my wife, and it's all about outdoor living. And Singapore, for instance, no opportunity to do that. So for us, coming back to Auckland and coming back to New Zealand is really about finding that balance between having a reasonable career where you're able to earn a sensible amount of money, but also being able to do the things in life that actually interest you and that you enjoy doing outside of work.
Well, knowing what you now know about the process, is there anything you would have changed in the way that you prepared to come back to New Zealand?
I think I would have done a better job of the thing that I suggested people do right at the very beginning. I would have done a better job of maintaining my contacts here in New Zealand. I kept a few. I probably didn't keep as many as I should have. And I probably didn't maintain those contacts as regularly as I should have.
Stefan, when you returned to New Zealand after being away for many years, did you experience a skill gap?
Probably a little bit to some extent. And I think the skill set gap, I made a very conscious decision when I left accountancy, when I left Deloitte & Touche way back when. I made a very conscious decision not to go into what I would call a typical line finance role where I'm looking after ledgers or doing tax returns or GST returns and so on. I wanted to work in a very analytical financial role, forward-looking, sitting with the business, helping the business make the right decisions about where they should be going over the course of the next 3, 4, 5 years. As a consequence of that conscious decision, I have never worked in a typical line finance type of role. So coming back to a market like New Zealand, which has a lot of small and medium-sized enterprises, I wouldn't say it's a skill gap per se, but what I would say is that the fact that I haven't had that experience of running a ledger or closing monthly accounts or necessarily doing a year-end audit possibly takes me out of contention for a number of roles with some of the smaller to medium-sized companies. So I think it probably narrowed the type of role that I could go for. I don't think it's necessarily a skill gap per se, because it's not an area that I've ever been interested in pursuing.
So what advice have you got today for young New Zealanders heading off on their OE?
I would say before you go overseas, don't go with the attitude of comparing overseas to home. I think it's the wrong mindset to go with. I think you should go overseas with a very open mind and try and understand how a different culture and a different country comes up with a different solution. And rather than saying, oh, well, it's better at home, fight those urges. Try and understand what's good about the place that you've gone to and what you can learn from it, rather than necessarily saying, oh, well, that's a more negative experience for me and back home we do it better. Be very clear when you come back to New Zealand, be very clear of the type of experience you want to get when you're overseas. Quite often people go overseas and it's about the travel. And it's not necessarily about getting the right level of experience. And actually, I think it should be about both. You should go overseas, you should enjoy Europe or wherever it happens to be that you're going, but be quite picky about the types of roles that you take when you're overseas. Because you could find 4 or 5 years in London working in roles that are not actually roles you want. Develop your career in a direction that you find it very hard to turn around. So the advice I would give is be picky about what roles you take. Think about them. Don't just take the first one. Have a plan for what it is you want to do and then religiously focus on it.
And what advice then for others returning to New Zealand? What advice would you give them about adapting to the local market?
Contacts. I think just make sure that when you go overseas, don't get caught up in the excitement of all of the travel and all of the new friends and all of the new experiences you're going to have, and make sure that you maintain your contacts here. If you have made a definitive decision to come back to New Zealand and you know that that's going to be what you're going to do when you leave, then keep working those contacts. Make sure people understand what it is you're doing and the type of experience that you've got, and keep talking to people while you're overseas. The financial remuneration you can get in other cities far outweighs the type of remuneration you can get here. So you need to be prepared to accept the fact that maybe monetarily you're not going to be as well rewarded in New Zealand as you will be in Sydney or London or Hong Kong or Singapore. Most people who come back to New Zealand are doing so because it's home, because of lifestyle, and because they want to have they want to live in a beautiful country with the people that they know.
If you think now about the teams you've been involved in, and I'm sure you've worked in many great teams, what is it that makes a great team?
I've always felt that teams work best when actually they're, in my view, the true definition of a team, and they work together. Yes, you need a leader, but actually 5 or 6 ideas coming from all members of staff, and a really open and open communication style within the team that allows ideas to be heard and ideas from everyone. That's the type of environment I really like to work in. And it's, to me anyway, the type of environment that I find myself most successful in. I like the ability to bounce ideas off other people. I like the idea that a solution is a collective effort. So the type of team where that type of debate is encouraged is the type of team that I would choose to work in every time.
What about soft skills? What soft skills are essential for success?
I think the ability to relate to others and to show a degree of empathy for the issues or the challenges that other people are facing. Quite often, and I've seen examples of this myself, senior executives are focused purely on the result, which is obviously extremely important, but don't necessarily focus on the impact on their staff of getting to that result. And I think the ability to show a degree of empathy, to show a degree of understanding of the challenges that team members are facing, goes an awful long way in creating goodwill within the team and a sense of understanding that your boss or your leader understands what it is you're going through. Yes, I still have to get the result, but that element of understanding, I think, helps a long way.
How do you keep on top of industry developments?
Lots of reading. It's basically lots of reading and lots of watching current affairs. And in the end, that's ultimately what I find is the easiest way of doing it. Obviously, you have to go through your professional development as part of your your accountancy background, continuous professional development, which I do as well. But it's really reading.
What advice can you give today to other graduates or other young people aspiring to the CFO role?
So first of all, make sure you have the basic technical expertise and the basic technical training. Without that, you won't go anywhere. But once you've got that, then I would say be focused on what it is, on the journey that you intend to take to get there. There are different ways of getting to a CFO role. I've taken a different route to the majority of CFOs, I would imagine. Whatever route is right for you, be focused on it and make sure that each role that you take in your career helps deliver you a little bit further along that journey, either because it gives you experience of a new culture or a new business or a new industry, or because it gives you the ability to close a skill gap or a leadership gap, a people leadership gap. That, you know, in finance organizations, sometimes you're working in quite small teams, and the ability to say, well, I've led 30 or 40 people doesn't come along that often. So pick your roles and make sure that every role you go into has a developmental opportunity for you.